thought tonight I'd anchor this talk with the four great vows. And because we chant them every day in the morning, and I've been chanting these four great vows for, well, about 45 years, you'd think I know them by heart. But it's a funny thing with chanting. If I'm not in the context of chanting them, I can't necessarily bring them to mind. It's this, I guess it's a kind of moment-specific kind of memory. And also sometimes when I chant, like we did the English Heart Sutra tonight, when we're in the midst of chanting, it's no problem, the motak's being hit, and I just chant it. But if I try to call up the words by myself outside of a chanting context, it's not so easy. And again, I've been doing that for about 45 years. So I guess it's a good place to start because our minds are quite tricky. I remember one of my early teachers had a line. He said something like, "Your mind is not your best friend." And of course, on one level it is. Without it, we'd be in trouble. But it also leads us to confusion, and as we get into the four great vows, we might say to delusion. So, though we need it and we protect it, it also is the thing that gets in our way and prevents us from being present and alive in this very moment that we're in. And our Zen practice, it's easy to forget this, but practice is oriented towards aliveness and awareness and action in our everyday life. Some people might cloister themselves in a monastery, but they're not doing that to shut off. They're doing it to become alive. And traditionally in Zen practice, there's a wearing down of our small self so that our natural, authentic, organic self can come through. There's a line in our temple rules that goes something like, if you can break the walls of self, you're already infinite in time and space. It's complicated, but in a sense, our nature is interconnected with everything else in this universe. We're all part of the same thing. The narrow walls of the small self block us off, and they make us isolated, and in a sense give us a feeling of being alone in the midst of everything. In the midst of abundance, we're hungry. So the first one of the four great vows, and I think every Zen group everywhere has these four great vows as their orientation. And some of them are stated differently, but they all come from the same Chinese. So the first one is, sentient beings are numberless, we vow to save them all. One thing to point out about all four of these is they're impossible. We start out, they're aspirational. They're pointers to point us in a direction. But each one of them states, we go from saving all numberless sentient beings. If it's numberless, it's impossible. It's just every one of them point us in a direction, but it's not about actually achieving something specific. It's pointing us in our practice. It's pointing us in a direction. So when I introduced our Kwanzaa Bosal chanting tonight, I talked about the name Kwanzaa Bosal means hearing the cries of the world. The Bodhisattva of compassion, Kwanzaa Bosal, is the ideal or the aspiration of the great Bodhisattva way, helping all beings. This orients us in our practice. Our learned, conditioned state of being tends towards self-centeredness and worrying about me. I, my, me. Different variations of the same thing. This I that we get stuck on is our small conditioned I that from very early on is in a constant state of creation in order to protect us in this very vulnerable world. We're born into this world and we're threatened with annihilation and death always. It's just the nature of being alive in the world. If you watch nature documentaries, you're constantly seeing the drama of eat or be eaten. And that's what we face. If you watch the birth of sea turtles, you'll see they're born in the sand and then they make their way, these tiny little creatures make their way to the ocean. And in that moment of going from where they're born to the ocean, a great percentage of them are snatched up by birds and eaten. That is life on this planet Earth. I suppose we say human beings are at the top of the food chain. So, especially living here in the city, we worry less about being eaten by another sentient being. But in this crazy life that we've created for ourselves, we worry about being robbed. We read stories of murder and mayhem all the time. And in our small, narrow view of this world, we're facing threats and we're protecting ourselves from threats. The Buddha said that this preoccupation with self actually creates our suffering. Chasing after things to satisfy ourselves creates the suffering in our lives. We say we suffer because we want what we don't have, or we're trying to protect what we do have from being taken away from us. All of this creates a narrow, walled-off self, which opens us up to suffering. Zen Master Bon Soeng, my teacher, had a line that he often said, and he says, "For me, suffering appears. For all beings, no suffering." So this practice direction of orienting ourselves to hear the cries of the world, to respond to the suffering, to move out of a place of self-centeredness into an experience of selflessness, opens us. And it orients us towards letting go of I, so that my true nature can actually reveal itself. So to live the Bodhisattva path is a way of orienting ourselves away from our self-centeredness towards giving, towards, I'm struggling to find the word because it's not exactly selflessness. It's more of a forgetting the self and using our life energy in a way that brings love and peace and harmony to the world, rather than the grasping that brings suffering, anger, and hatred and division into the world. It says sentient beings are numberless, we vow to save them all. If they're numberless, how could we possibly save them all? There's one view of this that says, if we completely wake up and orient ourselves towards helping, all sentient beings are already saved. That's a nice sentiment. But I think all of us in our experience of our everyday life, we need the reminder to break out of our self-centeredness and open our hearts towards others. So these 4 great vows start with that point of direction. Again, quoting Zen Master Bon Soeng, he said, "The purpose of Zen is to understand our true nature and help this world." And they're really not two things. As we orient ourselves towards giving, towards letting go of the self, we can actually open up to what's here. If we're in a grasping, give it to me mode, we're narrowing the world and we're making self and other. I guess it's coming to mind more than once as I'm speaking, so I might as well state it. It's reminding me of the wonderful teaching from Zen Master Dogen, which says to study Buddhism is to study the self. We start off with this understanding, what am I? Not intellectually, experientially. And then he says to study the self is to forget the self. Forgetting the self is the place of helping to save all sentient beings. And he concludes with, to forget the self is to be enlightened by all things. Once we forget the self, once we let go of this self-centeredness, there's an openness. There's a place of connection. And each moment, each thing awakens us. We'll get to a little bit more of that as we go down this list. The second of the vows is, delusions are endless. We vow to cut through them all. First of all, once again, they're endless, and we vow to cut through them all. So it's not possible. Although if you look at it another way, we vow to meet each one of our delusions as it arises, see it, cut through it, and again, return to the more natural, open, aware state that's available actually to all of us. Zen is premised on the fact that we're already free. We're already complete. It's just that we've built those walls that stop us from experiencing it and manifesting it. These delusions are bricks in the wall. I had an experience last week, and it's a minor, fairly costly experience for me, but not really a very serious problem. But when I look at it, it points to a particular kind of delusion. So, as Paul said, I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm still a little bit behind the times. I keep my schedule in a date book. So, I've got a weekly planner, and I can see my whole schedule. So, my last appointment on Thursday night, I have 2 different couples that I see on opposite weeks. And last week, I noticed that one of the couples was in my book, but an hour early. And I understood why they were an hour early, because my earlier appointment wasn't coming that night. So I saw that couple in that time, and I said, okay, that's my last appointment. And I just assumed, looking at it, that it was true. Later that night I was home, and I saw I had this email from my last couple saying, where were you? How come you weren't here? And I realized at that moment, what I actually knew was that the first couple who were an hour earlier were stuck, that wasn't their usual week. But because I saw their names, I just assumed it was their usual week. That's how minds operate. We see something, it cues up a way of seeing the world, and we can explain away a lot of things or not look deeply enough because of the stimulus that we're noticing. Does that make sense? I don't know if I said that clearly enough. So because I saw those people's names, I just assumed that it was their week. And it wasn't. So to me, this is a small example of things that happen all the time. We make assumptions, we have ideas, we have beliefs, and those ideas, beliefs, desires color our view. To me, a way of seeing it, it's as if our delusions are like a pair of sunglasses. And we wear these sunglasses all the time, and we don't even know we're wearing them. So we see the world through the lens of our own delusions. Zen Master Bon Soeng would describe our delusions as wanting, holding, attaching, and checking. These are four different, very similar in many ways, that our minds grasp at things. We want things, and in that wanting, we get deluded. I think all of us can point to experiences in our lives that our wanting something pushed us in the direction of doing things that we know are not okay. But because we want them, we figure out a way to justify it. Same for things that we get attached to. We hold on to things. People ask us for things. We want to be generous, but I want it. It's mine. For me, that kind of grasping. And these delusions color our view. So in the Four Great Vows, we say, cut through the delusion so we can see things more clearly. We can cut through the delusion to be able to manifest our true nature. But our delusions are so varied and in many ways unconscious. So this vow points us to the responsibility of knowing ourselves. And much of what we do in this meditation hall has to do with uncovering delusion and seeing more clearly. We spend hours in meditation asking the question, what am I? And then watching. Some of you have heard me say this before, but when I was doing my master's thesis, I found a quote by an early 20th century Zen teacher named D.T. Suzuki, and he talked about enlightenment as being an experience of making the unconscious conscious, bringing up what's out of our awareness. So many times as a therapist, I talk to people who are struggling with either anxiety or depression or sadness or dissatisfaction in general, and we don't really have an idea why. We just know we feel disconnected. And it takes a process of uncovering these delusions, these unexpressed, unconscious feelings. And once we do that, there's a way that we can find a little bit more freedom. We can cut through these delusions. And again, experience the spontaneity and aliveness of the moment. The third vow is, we say the teachings are infinite. We vow to learn them all. I've seen this vow written differently, and I think it's actually a more clear way to perceive the meaning of this vow. And it's written, Dharma gates are endless. We vow to enter them all. And I like that one better as a way of speaking about it, because it points to the alive experience of now. Each one of us is experiencing a now-ness, a now moment. The teaching tells us completely enter it, completely engage it, not just the ones we like. The teaching doesn't say, enter the moment that you like, stay away from the moment you don't like. The teaching says, whatever the experience is, be there. One of the delusions that we have is the wanting of the positive and the rejecting of the negative. We sometimes get into a state of hypervigilance, trying to control our world, thinking if we just control our circumstances, then we'll get a good outcome and we'll avoid the bad outcome. Of course, on some level, we have to do that. But we can get lost in our vigilance and in our trying to make things turn out a particular way, that again, we fall more into suffering, more into delusion, less connected to ourselves and the world around us, and more into those painful states that the Buddha originally was trying to address. So the teaching is, step into the moment. Be vulnerable. We start off our practice recognizing that we don't know. And if we can get comfortable with that not knowing, if we avoid what makes us uncomfortable and we grasp at what makes us comfortable, we think that's going to bring us happiness. But the result is actually more suffering. A kind of deeper aliveness and happiness comes from entering the moment that we're in. I think all of us know, if we pay attention, how we avoid situations, how we try to control things to keep ourselves safe and protected. And of course, on some level, we need to do that. But I think it's helpful to know that there's some kind of trade-off that's happening. The more we separate and protect, the less we're alive. And the more dissatisfaction grows out of that lack of aliveness. So that teaching, Dharma gates are endless. I vow to enter. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail. Sometimes we stay upright, sometimes we fall down. If we perceive our nature more clearly and we know ourselves more deeply, we have the capacity to show up and to be present and to try. I often quote this line from Zen Master Bon Soeng. His tagline was, try, try, try for 10,000 years non-stop. That's the meaning of entering the numberless Dharma gates. Show up, pay attention, keep yourself oriented towards helping, being aware of our delusions and finding our way through them, and then be there. Act, be alive. Seems to me inconceivable might be better stated non-conceptual. We can't conceive of it because our concepts are limiting. We make smaller the vastness that there is. In our attempt to create concepts, we limit, we make small. Our practice is to broaden and to make big. If we break the walls of the self, already infinite in time and space. Infinite in time and space means right here, right now. This is it. It's not endless kalpas going off in the distance. Everything comes back to right now. you want to find the Buddha way, find this moment. Where does your next step go? That is the Buddha way. So, if we can break free of concept, then we're alive in the Buddha way. If we're lost in our own conceptual understanding, trying to shape the world to fit our own conceptual understanding, we've lost the path. So these 4 vows: sentient beings are numberless, we vow to save them all. Delusions are endless, we vow to cut through them all. The teachings are infinite, we vow to learn them all. The Buddha way is inconceivable, we vow to attain it. We chant these 4 vows every morning. And if we're on retreat, we chant it at the end of the retreat night. It's a constant reminder to, when we put our foot down, to feel it, to be present and alive in this very moment that we're living, and to let go of the rope and let yourself fall. But not falling down into oblivion, falling right into the Dharma gate, entering in. It's a bit of a warrior practice. It's having the energy and the commitment to show up and to help. And if we do that over and over and over again, we learn how to be a Buddha, to be Bodhisattva. Or, let me say that again. To be Buddha and to live the life of the Bodhisattva. That is our way. And it's not an esoteric way. It's not dependent on these robes or any of the forms that we use. It's dependent on our own aliveness, our own work of digging ourselves out from underneath the weight of our desires and our delusions, and making the commitment to show up, be present, and to try to help this world. And the world really needs us. The world really needs for us to wake up, to shake off the chains of our delusions and our grasping, so that we can be alive. Look around yourselves. Look, while you're walking in the streets, look around. There's a deadness that we as people are stuck in. And the promise of our practice is to wake up and to be alive and present and awake.